very much, Mr. Federico Blanco. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Nick Wetherell, Executive Director, International Cocoa Initiative. So 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So for those that don't know, the International Cocoa Initiative is an independent non-profit foundation that was established to unite the forces of civil society, the private sector and governments in the search for solutions to what is a very persistent and widespread problem, being child labor, and particularly hazardous child labor in cocoa production. I won't dwell on these numbers because they've been mentioned twice already, but it is important, I think, always to point out that the very large and worrying caseload of child labor in cocoa is a subset of a much bigger caseload of child laborers in agriculture, both in Africa and globally. Importantly, about 99% of the caseload of child labor is estimated to take place on the family or the extended family farm. Therefore, cocoa child labor is not unique or specific to cocoa, but there are indeed some cocoa-specific drivers which antagonize the problem. Cocoa is very labor-intensive. It's grown on smallholder farms where there is a tradition or a recourse through poverty to depend on the labor of the household. Strong traditions of migration across the region, which actually bring people into contexts where they don't necessarily have the same protection of the state and the community. Low yields from marginal trees, marginal crops, marginal lands, also driving low income and therefore the poverty that is at the heart of this. And real challenges with a lack of basic social infrastructure in cocoa growing communities, such as schools. Not specific to cocoa, but definitely a big issue in cocoa. And a big issue because it's not only a symptom of the supply chain not being sustainable, it has poor farmers at the heart of it. They're not thriving. But it also perpetuates that unsustainability by, as my friend and former ICI board member Kailash Satyarthi has shown, it takes children out of the education that they need to become perhaps the more business-minded, numerate, literate farmers of the future. Now, I will respectfully challenge my friend Ange's presentation of a very static situation where nothing has been done and nothing is changing. This is what's happened according to statistics from the US Department of Labor's surveys, national surveys, with child labor in Ivory Coast and Ghana from 2008 to 2014. Definitely not static. On one side, the caseload of child labor in absolute terms has increased 21%. So a growing burden of child labor in the sector. However, that needs to be set against the changes in cocoa production in those countries, a 40% increase in cocoa production over that period of time, and an 80% increase in the number of cocoa growing households over the same period of time. So there are two sides to the coin. It is, of course, a growing problem and a growing responsibility for the sector, but it's not strictly true to say that nothing is improving. If you look at the prevalence of child labor in an average cocoa growing household over that period of time, it has actually declined by 14%. Not enough, but it has gone down. And if you put the last bars on that graph, if you put that alongside the prevalence of child labor in agricultural households that grow other crops other than cocoa, you'll see that actually in a cocoa farming household, the prevalence of child labor is less. The ICI, the model that we have is a multi-stakeholder initiative, meaning, as I mentioned earlier, that we work with the private sector, but also with civil society, and really importantly with the national governments in the producing countries. This is essential because, again, as was mentioned earlier, of course the solution to this has got to be a shared responsibility. Different actors have different roles to play, in what is undeniably a very complex challenge. The multi-stakeholder model is also essential to bringing the diversity of skills that is required. NGOs are very, very good at understanding child protection and poverty alleviation. They're maybe not very good at understanding the cocoa supply chain. Companies are very good at understanding what can be done within the supply chain, but they may not be poverty experts. So bringing those together is really important. And of course, balancing off these different interests is very important also to having a certain independence and credibility to the work that is underway. Our strategy is focused on three main pillars. One, which really is around tackling the root causes of child labor in the communities themselves. It's the prevention pillar, by promoting child-centered community development with a strong emphasis on education and vocational training, but also really critically a strong push on gender empowerment. The other pillar that I'd like to focus on more now is the promotion of responsible supply chain management by the private sector themselves, recognizing that within all the things that need to be done, companies do have a responsibility to be vigilant over their supply chains, to identify human rights impacts that may exist, and to take action where they're identified. So I'm going to just drill down onto that for the remainder of my time, just to say that both of these approaches, we've seen promising results. It's not eradication or elimination, but for child-centered community development, we've seen that the rates of child labor can be brought down by about 20% over a period of 3 years with the right sort of social investments. On the supply chain side, where companies are monitoring and remediating child labor in their supply chains, we've also seen about a 50% removal of child laborers from the supply chain over the same period of time. So there is reason to be cautiously optimistic, of course, that we're starting to find things that work. And for us, the key is we need to put these together. You shouldn't only depend on the private sector to monitor and remediate. You also need investments in communities, which of course comes down to a big responsibility for the governments themselves to invest in the education and tackling those root causes. On the responsible supply chain side, we've developed what's called a CLMRS, Child Labor Monitoring and Remediation System for cocoa, which is really, I think, helping companies fulfill their due diligence responsibilities within their supply chain, putting the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into action. I won't go through all the steps, but there are three key things that are different about this and new. First, before, this problem was treated as a compliance issue, and it was thought that if you could send third-party auditors unannounced into a remote African village, they'll find child labor, and if they find child labor, they'll punish the farmers and take away their certification premiums, which, of course, when farmers are poor and don't have alternatives, perhaps is not the smartest approach. So this is about embedding a system within the communities themselves. It's the farmers themselves who monitor each other, and they discuss with each other what's going on the farm and whether or not they're resorting to child labor. So it's not a policing system, and we find it brings the issue much more to the surface. Farmers recognize that they're not being policed and they won't necessarily be punished, and therefore they're more open to talk about it and acknowledge the phenomenon. And of course, it's only when you can identify a problem that you can address it. So the really key second step in this is that farmers are not punished in the first instance, they're helped to find alternatives. So we have a remediation response which helps kids get into school, helps mothers earn income, helps children get birth certificates that they need to register in school, etc. So as a result, the issue stays comparatively on the surface, and we're able to target assistance. And through that assistance, as I mentioned earlier, at least initial evaluations and assessments have suggested that more than 50% of child laborers are being taken out of the circumstances through this approach. So this has been made central to an aligned industry initiative called COCO Action that's seeking to roll out CLMRS and a bunch of other actions for 300,000 farmers and 1,200 communities. And as we're seeing really quite an impressive scale-up now in the application of CLMRS over the last 6 years, so that by the end of this year, we estimate, just from our work alone, we'll have more than 120,000 farmers in more than 150 cooperatives working with 7 companies to implement child labor monitoring and remediation. So things are happening. Final, more sobering note, in addition to the positive results that we're seeing, and again, just to say, more than 15,000 child labor is identified through this, so it picks up, we estimate, more than 60% of the child labor that's there and takes 50% of that out. But a sobering note is that even if we get to 300,000 farmers covered by these systems by 2020, which is the target, that's still only going to be 15% of the total number of farmers in the supply chain. So we have a scaling challenge. We know stuff works. We need to scale it. How do we scale it? This is a heavy system. It takes a lot of investment. And now ourselves and our members are going to spend the next few years really looking at what innovation can bring to make this a more scalable solution, but also, very importantly, pushing for those social policies to happen through the governments and others so that the risk of child labor tackled at the root cause reduces, which means the burden on companies to monitor for child labor and address it also likewise should go down over time. Thank you.